Hi guys, this is Mr. Tan here, and today we will be looking at week 1 and session 1 for international business. We will be looking at international business linked to UCA. So obviously we're going to go through an introduction. We're going to try and break the question down and understand what the question actually wants in terms of the first learning outcome, and obviously looking at and reviewing the key word or words, and then the key parts in the question, because if you don't understand the question then you really can't answer it. We're going to be looking at different concepts and characteristics of international business, reviewing the rationale for why you want to go to different international markets when you're in your home market, reviewing the different types of routes for international businesses, as well as taking into consideration the advantages and disadvantages, because if you're going to go international, well, what route are you going to take? And then taking into consideration some kind of like macroeconomic barriers, and taking like pestel factors which could affect your decision making process when deciding which international market to go into. So if we review the first learning outcome, we can see that this says, understand the main characteristics, challenges, and opportunities of international markets and strategies available to business. So understand the main characteristics, challenges, and opportunities of international markets and strategies available to business. So first of all, we need to identify and highlight the key word. The key word here obviously is to understand, and if we look at the dictionary in terms of what this says in terms of this key word, it means to interpret or view something in a particular way. So we interpret or view something, so we need to gain a deeper understanding, to conduct a deeper research, to interpret that, to view it in a different way. And if we now go down to the question, we understand what the key word is. Then what are the different parts of this question that we need to understand? Well, it says the main characteristics and challenges. So what are the main characteristics of going international or different international markets? The opportunities, what's the rationale for why you want to go international when you're stable? Because going international will basically mean you're going to incur more costs, but there are going to be more opportunities. So what's the rationale for why you want to go international? And then it says, what are some of the strategies available to businesses? Well, the strategies, we can look at the different routes available to a company to want to go international, but those routes are going to come with kind of pros and cons in terms of the degree of risk that will be attached to that, and a degree of control that will be attached to these different strategies available to businesses. So we're going, throughout the course of this lecture, we're going to break these things down, and hopefully you will understand all these different parts to answer this question. And this begs the question of when, where, what, who, how, and why. And all these things matter. These things matter because when you do it, where you do it, what you do, who you do it, how you do it, and why you do it is going to have an effect on your bottom line. It's going to have an effect on your profit and loss in terms of the market you go in, the concept that you adopt in relation to your business model, and how it is implemented. So again, and this is going to have a major effect. So all these questions ultimately are going to affect your bottom line, your sales, your cost of goods sold, your administration charges, and your net profit. Let's look at some definitions of international marketing, and you will see that there are loads of definitions out there. International marketing is the performance of business activities that direct the flow of goods and services to consumers and users in more than one nation. Okay, direct the flow of goods and services to consumers and users in more than one nation. Okay, so sense. Um, the performance of business activities designed to plan, price, promote, and direct the flow of the company's goods and services to consumers and users in more than one nation for profit. So here now we've kind of got elements of the marketing mix: product, price, place, promotion. The extended marketing mix being people, process, and physical evidence. And then it's talking about more than one nation, and then it's adding in for the purpose of profit. Because with the private sector, obviously, the private sector are going to want to make a profit. Global marketing is concerned with integrating and standardization marketing actions across a number of geographic areas. Okay, this is more marketing is concerned with integrating and standardization, more of a global type marketing approach, integrating standardization marketing actions across, and the reason for the integrating and standardization is to sell the same product across a wide range of nations in order to lower the costs. And therefore, if you think about the above definition in terms of making more profit, which international marketing consists of finding and satisfying global customers' needs better than the competition, both domestic and international, and coordinating marketing activities with the constraints of the global environment. So, looking again, bringing in different elements in terms of identifying customers' needs, bringing in competition, doing it better than the competition, bringing in terms of global markets, constraints of the global, coordinating marketing activities with the constraints of a global environment. Because do you standardize your marketing mix, or do you tailor make each of your marketing mix depending upon the countries you go in? Because if you tailor make it, it's going to cost more money. If you standardize it, it's going to cost less, depending upon what you want to do to satisfy global customers' needs. How do you satisfy consumers' needs? So again, we've got different definitions here. So you would want to start off by providing a few definitions, and perhaps because you're in the second year of H&D now, maybe you want to come up with some kind of definition of your own and how you see international marketing. So you take the definitions and then you give your own point of view in terms of how you personally see it, maybe. Okay. Again, very important to when, where, what, who, how, and why we do things. Very, very. If we look at the nature of international marketing, the nature, there are various elements to the nature of international marketing. So obviously you lead into these questions with definitions of international marketing, and then you may want to lead into the question in terms of the nature of international marketing. Well, the nature of international marketing is that it has a broader markets are available. Okay, but we'll come on to that. More markets are available, similar type consumers. So uncontrollable variables. If you're going into another market, you may not know that market, so there may be many different variables that may be uncontrollable. We've seen, the fact that Tesco's went into the USA, and even though they went into the USA, to be quite honest, they were not successful for many different uncontrollable variables that were not taken into consideration. Requires a broader competence of different skills, looking at and applying, a marketing strategy which may be different to your marketing strategy in your domestic market. Looking at your segmentation, your targeting, and your positioning strategy, which would then influence your extended marketing mix, your product, price, place, promotion, people, process, and physical evidence. And this requires a broader competence of skills if you're going to be going internationally or globally. Again, competition, if you're entering into a new market with similar types of goods and products, there's going to be competition is going to be intense. Okay, it involves high risk. Just because you go international, you're going to incur more costs. Yes, you may be selling more, you may gain economies of scale, so your cost of goods may be lower. However, you're still going to have additional administration costs within your profit and loss account. and you're not guaranteed of success. Nothing is guaranteed, and you could spend lots of money going in there and eventually losing all of that. When we're talking at international markets and global markets, we're really saying to ourselves, it's about people, people who are around the world who have, similar interests, tastes, and needs. Okay, so we can see that, we have consumers around the world, and there are similar consumers with similar needs around the world, and it's so important today, in today's environment, to tap in to other markets, to the global market. And we need to bring barriers down. We need to be working from one nation to another. Even if we think about the latest coronavirus, we need to be working from a global perspective, one could argue, because if we don't work from a global perspective, then we're not trying to overcome these barriers that we need to. So from a company perspective, if you don't go international, you don't go global, then maybe another company or another competitor from another country will come into your domestic market and compete against you. When we look at some of the key concepts, because if we go back to P1, P1 said the two main areas in P1, which was the scope which we are defining to be the different routes to internationalization, and then the key concepts. So when we're looking at the key concepts, we're looking at basically domestic market orientation, multi-market orientation, and global market orientation. So we're looking at three types of market orientations a company could adopt. So if we look at the domestic marketing orientation, we can see that it's really an extension. Multi domestic marketing orientation, we can see that the companies have a strong sense that foreign country markets are vastly different. So here the view in terms of a multi-domestic market orientation is that when they see foreign markets, they see them as completely different. The market success requires an almost independent program for each country. Separate marketing strategies, subsidiaries operate independently of one another in establishing marketing objectives and plans, and products are adapted for each market. Control is decentralized for that other market. So in the multi-domestic market orientation, they see other countries as being very important in terms of tapping in to a new marketplace with sales opportunities and potentials. But here, as we've said before, we can see the separate marketing strategies, subsidiaries, and products being adapted. Okay, and then we also have. So when we look at the global market orientation, really we are assuming that all consumers in all countries are the same or very, very similar. And these are best suited for standardized products with little differentiation. GM allows for centralized coordination of critical business functions. Global marketing strategy assumes all consumers in all the countries or geographic regions are the same or very, very similar. And this strategy is best suited for standardized products such as as copy machines such as Coca-Cola, where there is very little need to product differentiate. Coca-Cola, for instance, can be found all over the world and is easily identified as such. Global marketing has distinct advantages following, allowing for centralized management and coordination of critical business functions such as human resources, finance, and product development. So we can see here the difference between kind of like a global market orientation and a multi-domestic market orientation. The global marketing orientation assumes that the common consumers are all very similar or the same, and you have standardization and where there is very little product differentiation. And again here it allows for kind of centralized management and coordination of critical business functions, as we said, the human resources, finance, and product development. Whereas this is in direct contrast to the multi-domestic orientation. They're the key concepts. And here, when talking about the key concepts, being it domestic, multi-domestic, or globalization, market orientation, you would try and give examples in those as well. So the next question, which really taps into P2, is why go international? And why go international? There are so many reasons of going international. If you're very successful in your own country and you've got competition, I know when I was, the marketing manager for Metro Products, we had loads of competition. We had Autolook, we had Crooklook, we had all sorts of products. There must have been about 15 to 20 different products on the marketplace competing at different price points, under £10, between 10 and £20, between 20 and £30, and at the £50 range, and even the £100 range. So there can be increased competition, which could itself mean that you may want to go and try and develop another country with not as much competition as you have in your own domestic market. In addition to that, there may be slow growth in your domestic market, so you may want to increase your growth by targeting and tapping into new markets. The competitive pressures may be too much in your own domestic market, and if you go in to sell internationally and you're doing very well, then your buying power is going to increase because you're going to gain economies of scale. Economies of scale meaning you can buy a vast amount of additional quantity at a cheaper price. So again, the unit cost, the cost of goods sold, taken away from your sales, gives you a greater gross profit and a gross profit margin. Your gross profit divided by sales times 100 gives you your gross profit percentage margin. It's obviously a new revenue stream, tapping into a new country. There's greater access to talent as well, because if you are now going international, depending upon if it's a multi-domestic or global, or even if you go on a domestic market orientation, you're still going to get access to different talent, to different people who know different things and information about their marketplace. And then you also have the potential of diversifying. So we can see that there are many different reasons for companies to actually go international and global. Even if we look at Zara, is a multi-billion pound organization which started as one store in Spain, now has over almost 2,000 stores worldwide, and their management and their distribution system, just in time, getting the concept of their dresses from concept to the marketplace literally within 6 weeks, which is unheard of. And generally the marketplace takes 6 months to get the dresses from concept, idea concept, to marketplace, to 6 months, but they've managed to do it now in 6 weeks. So which has led to billions of pounds of profit, which is the vast majority of the overall group's profits. So again, why go international? Diversifying, access to talent, potential more profit, economies of scale, and there may be limited growth and too much pressure in your own country, and maybe slow growth. So you may be better off going international to grow. So definitely lots of different reasons. Again, here, use examples of different companies in terms of why companies may want. Again, when really what it boils down to are two factors when we are deciding if, because if we are to go international, then it is going to involve costs. And you may be doing very well in your domestic market, so you could argue, why do you want to go international if you're doing very well in your domestic market? Because if you go internationally, well, then it's going to incur additional costs and you're not guaranteed for success. So the question really is, if you do go international, what are some of the factors that go into kind of influence you in terms of determining how you should go international? So let's look at some of the ways, and then later on we're going to go into more detail on those different routes to internationalization. And then at the same time as looking at those different routes, we will then view the some of the advantages and disadvantages of those. Some of the ways include licensing. They include franchising. Now, if you can see this graph, so you've got two kind of like factors. One is ownership and one is control. So what I am saying is that it's the level of ownership you will have with different routes to internationalization, licensing and franchising, which is um, limited, very lowest levels of ownership, and franchising, lowest levels of ownership. And then on the bottom level, you've got control from 0 to 100. And here we can see, licensing, you have less control than you do franchising. Um, with franchising, it moves on to more control with management contracts. But then in terms of ownership, if you went to, you kind of like middle of the road in terms of control for joint ventures, but you have more ownership over equity joint ventures than licensing, franchising, and management. And then finally, we have ownership and shared alliances. So ownership, where you have your own businesses in another market. You might have your own retail stores in another marketplace. But again, um, there you've got 100% control. If it's your set up your own um, McDonald's stores in Russia, which is not a franchise, but is your own McDonald's store, for argument's sake, in um, Russia, and you have 100% ownership, so you have 100% control, but 100% ownership. However, the underlying factor here, which determines what you should really do, is the degree of risk. Is the risk combined with ownership and control. So what is it that you want? Do you want the ownership and control, which then allows you to do and decide what you do, but equally the ownership and control means a greater degree of risk for the money that you've invested to go into that new marketplace. And likewise, if you see management contracts, the risk will be less than ownership and shared alliances. And likewise, the least risky option can be seen to be licensing in terms of investment of your own resources. However, your ownership and control are going to be minimal in comparison to other ways of entering the marketplace. So the factors that you need to really take into consideration are, what do you want? Ownership, control, combined with the degree of risk, which are these factors that need to be thought out. And when we think about it, the movement of goods, products, physical or services across different barriers and national barriers, it's going to cost money to ship your goods across from your domestic market to another market. It's going to cost a lot of money in terms of transportation, in terms of setting up distribution centers in another country, depending upon how you do it, depending upon if you have your own offices, setting up offices, having all these additional costs, and then developing marketing strategies, information systems, use of the marketing mix before you've even sold anything, and then you're still not guaranteed to have sold anything. So it's a huge investment, a huge risk. So it all boils down to ownership, control, and a degree of risk which you feel that you want to take on board. So let's kind of look at some of these kind of like ways to go international. So when we look at licensing, well, we say to ourselves, well, what is licensing? Well, if we're looking at licensing, is one company provides the brand, know-how, etc. company for fees and royalties. When we look at the definition, it's the method of foreign operations whereby a firm in one country agrees to permit a company in another country to use the manufacturing, processing, trademark, know-how, or some other skill provided by the licensor. Okay, so it's using that company's brand, know-how, um, to sell, or know-how or skill of the licensor into another country. It's very similar to a franchise operation, but we will look at the difference between franchises and licensing in a second. So let's look at some of the advantages and disadvantages of a licenser. So if we're saying that, again, the franchise agreement, again, if you're using the example of McDonald's, so going back to the graph, we can see that the licensor is actually the franchisee actually has and owns the business. So he might buy a McDonald's franchise, and in the McDonald's franchise, they actually follow the processes of McDonald's on like a licensee in terms of how things are actually done in the business. So in McDonald's, for example, the setup will be the same. The franchisee doesn't determine how the machine is all set up, doesn't determine which machine to use. That is all bought by bought as part of the package, as part of the franchise. So the whole thing is set up, the whole store, the logos, all the layout is done, all the training is done, all the manuals are done in a certain way, how the staff are trained. There's 2 big books in each McDonald's store in terms of how the operations of the store is conducted. There's even a McDonald's university where the staff and managers and owner would actually go to McDonald's university to be trained in terms of the operations, processes and practices of the franchisee. So they're actually, even though they own their own business, but they don't own the trademark and the branding, they follow the processes and the operations of that franchise and how things are to be done in terms of making this successful. So in that respect, the franchisor has slightly more control and influence over what and how the business conducts and how the business conducts itself, because it has to adhere to the rules and policies of the franchisor. So therefore having more control. So there's a slight difference there between the franchise and a license agreement. So now when we look, sometimes these management contracts are confused with franchise agreements, but they're actually different to a franchise agreement. When we look at this, the example to give is when, for example, you have, excuse me, have a chain of hotels, for example. So if you have own a hotel chain A, you might seek to make a management contract with a company B over the operational control of one specific hotel. So, under that management contract, B would gain the operational control of looking, after that hotel, and in turn, you would pay a specified fee to that company B. So company B would be allowed to run the hotel in any way specified by the management contract. But on the other hand, you might want a franchise deal with company C, which would then allow company C to use a trademark of A and perhaps use part of the business models of A or part tools of A. C, would pay a specified fee to you. So when we're looking at this, we're saying that if we're looking at management contracts, we're saying that if you've got a whole chain of management hotels, then you just take one of those hotels and you could offer another company to manage that in the way that you want them to manage it. So again, contract is a separate enterprise that performs the necessary managerial functions. Now when we look at this, we can say to ourselves, there are different things that we need to take into consideration. So these 3 parts common to kind of management contracts include, the conditions to the contract, the conditions to the contract. The lengthest and the detailed part of the management contract is, naturally the conditions of it. The contract must clearly identify the parties involved and the functions that are being transferred to the management company. So this is very, very important to ensure that there is a management contract there which specifies what that new management company needs to perform, their duties, their tasks, and their responsibilities. And it needs to be clear. It needs to be clear, otherwise, this can cause lots of problems if one party has expected the company to carry out certain operations. Next, you have, you can, we looked at joint ventures. Joint ventures are run by two or more companies where you share the risk, you share the resources, and you have more or different expertise coming in to combine this. However, the ownership is shared, so you don't have 100% ownership depending upon your contractual terms and what percentage you're going into the business, if it's 50-50, 60-40, or however the financial structure is determined. You won't own all the business, so someone else will own part of your business. But then again, the risk will be less because they will be putting in the expertise, the finance, and depending upon what you negotiate. And then eventually we have ownership, and full ownership, I'd move forward too fast. Full ownership is taking on board and setting up operations in another country, and again you have 100% control and 100% risk, but the potential profits, you could maximize your profits because you're not sharing it and you have no middlemen, so you're making all the profits, but there are increased risks for that. And we've seen the increased risks like Tesco's, they expanded into the US. They couldn't compete with Walmart for a range of reasons. The portion sizes were too small, and they just couldn't compete. And eventually, they had to pull out of the US, losing $2 billion. So we can see there, you can get 100% ownership and control in terms of how things are done, how things are run, and control over the supply chain. However, you're not guaranteed for success. So, what are some of the key barriers? Because part of the so part of the question is looking at what are going to be some of the key barriers that's going to affect your you know some of the key barriers in terms of, as we said before, with the licensing, franchising, contract, joint ventures, ownership, is going to be depending upon the degree of risk and control that you want for your company. But there are risks to social and cultural barriers, legal and political barriers, economic barriers. So depending upon the country you're going in, how is that going to affect your business? If you're Toyota and you've got legal and political influences in terms of the UK, and we've got Brexit, so we can see that with Brexit in the UK, how is that going to affect Toyota? Well, we're not 100% sure yet because we don't know the trade negotiations between the UK and Europe, between exporting cars. But if it stood the way it was, then potentially, the manufacturing of the cars of Toyota in the UK and then exported to Europe without any negotiation could increase costs because there would be additional tariff barriers. So if there are additional tariff barriers, then that could increase the overall cost of the car once it's sold in Europe. Therefore, what are going to be those legal and political barriers? So if you were thinking about developing a new plant in the UK, you might because it was cheaper to distribute, but you may decide not to set up a manufacturing plant in the UK, but rather a manufacturing plant in Europe, which won't incur those tariff barriers, perhaps. So again, social and cultural barriers. What are the social and cultural barriers? And economic barriers. We have to say to ourselves, how are these factors actually going to affect um, economic factors within the UK or a specific country? So these are some of the factors that are going to determine, which country you may decide to want to go into or another. Do you have political stability in the country? Because if a country is unstable, maybe you don't really want to, trade in that country. If the country is not doing well economically, then maybe you can't get the desired price of the product that you want to sell in that country because the people can't afford it. So these factors again need to be taken into consideration. Okay, now and ultimately what we're talking about, all these factors are going to have an effect on your profit margins. So again, these things need to be taken. Other factors that you need to take into consideration, even in terms of the marketing mix, social economic factors, the language, the values, the religious attitudes. There are certain things you can and can't do in certain countries. Economic barriers in terms of currency shifts, legal and political barriers in terms of international, regulations, trade restrictions. All these things do need to be taken into consideration depending upon which country you're actually going into. And more importantly, how is it going to affect your product? And how is it going to affect the marketing? Can you adopt standardization, or do you have to go for kind of like a multi-domestic market orientation approach where each country and each type of people are different, where you have to tailor make each product, which is going to incur more costs? So what are you going to go for? Are you going to go for a more standardized approach, or are you going to go for a more individual differentiated approach? So what are you going to go for? When we look at these in terms of BMW, we try to apply this to BMW. Again, you know, BMW, what's going to be their management in terms of their skills? If they want to go international, what about the distance, transportation, costs, transfer costs, depending upon the country that they want to go into and the countries that they want to market? If at the moment, BMW sells a large percentage of cars to the UK marketplace. Okay, and but the distance, transportation costs, and transfer costs are actually different than if they wanted to target the US. But the US, has you know over 4 or 5 times more population than the UK. So it's a much bigger marketplace. But distance, transportation costs are going to be different, and there's going to be greater risks involved. And also, what about the government tariffs, protection, and policies? If BMW wanted to market in the US, well, the US in terms of trade policies and bringing up barriers and tariffs and everything else, the US government has had a policy between the US and China in terms of protectionism policies, where they've increased tariffs on all Chinese goods coming into the US. And likewise, China has done that on American goods. But at the same time, Donald Trump has suggested that, goods coming in from Europe will suffer the same consequences in terms of higher tariffs. So, exactly, how if you want to, market internationally, depending upon government tariffs and protection policies, it could also, make you think twice about which market you want to go into. Um, so these issues again need to be taken. And likewise, the rise of quotas and protection or inefficient industry. So again, all of these things need to be taken into consideration if you're a company and you're looking at going into another marketplace. And you'll need to look at this in terms of how it actually affects your company. So, do you go globally straight away? Do you go international? Do you use a domestic market orientation approach or a multi-domestic market orientation approach, or do you take a global market orientation approach? Depending upon the barriers that face your company within the marketplace that you want to go into. So all these factors of management, skills, the distance transportation costs, the rise of quotas, protection of inefficient industry, tariffs imposed on exports and transit, government tariffs, protectionist policies are going to have an influence on you deciding which country you should or should not go into when you go into it. Because you're not just going to go into any country just for the sake of doing it, because it's going to. So very, very important to. So when looking at this question, we've kind of looked at the key the questions and breaking down the questions. We looked at P1, P1 looking at the scope and key concepts, the scopes being the different routes and the key concepts of domestic, multi-domestic and globalization. We've looked at P2 in terms of the rationale for going into the different international routes, P3 in terms of P4 in terms of the pros and cons of the different routes, and then P3 in terms of the decision-making process and things that you would take into consideration when deciding which markets that you want to go into. Um, we looked at definitions of international marketing, and the nature of international marketing. We've looked at the key concepts and the reasons to go international. We've looked at the different routes of going international, including a license agreement, a franchise agreement, a management contract, a joint venture, or 100% ownership. And also we've looked at some pros and cons of this. And then we've looked at some of the barriers in terms of the barriers are going to affect decision making process. The decision making process in terms of why you should go into that country as opposed to another country, combined with the factors of ownership, control, and the degree of risk the company wants to partake in. So these things we've looked at. So I hope this has been helpful for you. It's a quick overview of questions P1, 2, 3 and 4. And really you need to do a little bit more or additional research to use with examples to finish this question off. So thank you today from Mr. Tan.